Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on how are people counted in the census. This is the second installment of our monthly census webinar series, and Asian Americans Advancing Justice AAJC will be hosting webinars on the census every month. If you missed our first webinar in August, the webinar on census frequently asked questions, you can check it out on our website at www.advancingjustice-aajc.org. So let's get started. Today, we will discuss how people are counted in the census, what a successful census entails, and what hard to count and undercount mean when it comes to counting our communities. We'll also dive deeper into how the census counts members of the military, individuals living in group quarters such as dorms, shelters, and more, non-traditional households, and children. This webinar will feature two guest speakers, Terri Ann Lowenthal and Bill OHare. So I'll turn it over to Terri Ann.
Thank you, Bessie, and hello, everybody. We are joined today by two nationally recognized experts and wonderful colleagues on census work. First, we'll hear from Terri Ann Lowenthal, who is not only a nationally recognized expert, but also a consultant and frequent speaker on the U.S. Census and policy issues affecting federal statistics. During a 14-year career as a congressional aide in both the House and Senate, she was staff director of the House Census Oversight Subcommittee from 1987 to 1994. And she is currently a consultant for the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Bill OHare, who we'll hear from next, is a demographer with more than 40 years of experience on the census. He was a senior associate with the Kids Count project at the Annie Casey Foundation. Bill is currently the president of OHare Data and Demographic Services, LLC, and consultant to the Leadership Conference Education Fund. So we will hear, as I said, from Terri Ann and Bill. And Terri Ann is going to focus a more overview of how people are generally counted in the census. And Bill will talk to us about how young children are counted in the census through Bill's fantastic work over the years. You know, we know that the undercount of young children is quite drastic. And so he'll talk to us about that a little more. So just a reminder, we talked last month about census FAQs, and if you missed it, you can check out the recording on our YouTube channel at the link. And this is sort of just going over a general timeline and general, how the census happens and functions. Next month, towards the end of October, we will be doing a deep dive on the communications messaging. We'll hear both about what the Census Bureau is doing with respect to their communications planning, as well as hear from our own Michelle Boykins, our Director of Strategic Communications, about what we've found from our census messaging research into the AA-NHPI community. So just as a reminder, why are we talking about this? Because the census impacts the AA-NHPI communities in many ways. The 2010 census showed that Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial group in the United States. The Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander population in California grew by 29% between 2000 and 2010. And most interestingly, we see a lot of growth in non-traditional gateway cities, right? So while California, New York, and Texas are the three largest Asian American populations by state, the fastest or highest growth rates that we saw during the last census were actually in Nevada, Arizona, North Carolina, and North Dakota. So we recognize too that part of why we do this work is because the census, both through this, through the decennial information as well as other information from other surveys such as the American Community Survey, really provides us valuable data about our communities, and particularly broken down through detailed group levels, which are critical to being able to properly plan and address the needs of our communities. And with that, I will turn it over to Terri Ann.
Thank you very much, Terri. Everyone, thanks for the opportunity to talk to you about the census and for your interest. You know, the Census Bureau could not take a successful census without your involvement and help. There is a lot to know about census operations and how people are counted, and you aren't going to learn everything today, but I hope to give you a framework to guide your Get Out the Count campaigns, as well as less formal activities to help ensure an accurate census in historically undercounted communities and of historically undercounted population groups. So, first we'll look at who is counted and where they should be counted, and then we'll jump to peak 2020 census operations and walk through the basic timeline and key components of the enumeration, because that's the best way to understand how people are counted. So off we go. Next slide, please. Before we talk about how people are counted, let me just talk quickly about who is counted and where. The Census Bureau has a detailed policy set of rules called formally residence criteria. It talks about where people in all kinds of situations could be counted. And just to start, the census itself counts all persons who live in the United States, regardless of their legal status, and that's because the Constitution says so. Now, where should people be counted? Since the very first census in 1790, the rule of thumb is at their usual place of residence. That is, according to the Census Bureau, where they live and sleep most of the time. Now, for some households, some families, that's really easy. But there are a lot of situations where things are nuanced or even complex. So, for example, college students, I'm just going to highlight a few common situations that attract a lot of questions. College students who are living away from home while they're attending school should be counted at their college residence, not at their parents' home. Incarcerated persons are counted at the prison or jail facility where they are housed on Census Day, despite a very significant campaign to try and get the Census Bureau to change that rule. And we're going to talk a little more about this later, but people experiencing homelessness are counted through what's called the service-based enumeration, or they are counted at the home where they are staying, however temporarily, on Census Day if there is no other what you would call usual residence. So that's sort of the boundaries of who's counted and where they should be counted. Again, the rules are in much more detail and available in writing. Next slide, please. So here we go, on to 2020. First thing I want you to know, the census does not start on April 1st. That is Census Day. However, it's only a reference date set in law, and the Census Bureau counts the residents of the country and where they live as of that date. So now we're going to walk through most of the major counting operations, some in more detail than others, and I have them listed on this slide. And on to the next slide, we're going to start with the first major phase of the census, the self-response phase. Now, when does the census actually start? If it doesn't start on April 1. Next slide, please. There we go. So first of all, fun fact, the enumeration actually starts in remote Alaskan villages in late January of 2020 because warming temperatures force residents to start moving to solid ground for hunting and fishing. But for most households, the census starts in mid-March of 2020. That's when, in the self-response phase, households can complete the census online, by telephone, or by mailing back a paper questionnaire, and no one will come to the door to visit them, even if they don't answer all of the questions. Now, again, this peak operation starts in mid-March. About 80% of homes will get a letter inviting them to respond online, and it will give them a unique code to use. There also will be a toll-free number, part of what's called Census Questionnaire Assistance, or CQA, that will be included in the initial mail-out, and people can call with questions or even to provide their answers over the phone. And about 20% of homes will get a paper form in the first mailing, although they also can go online to answer the census or call. And there will be a unique code or a barcode on the paper questionnaire. And finally, for the first time in 2020, mailings will go out in 3 waves. So everything doesn't go in the mail at once in 2020. Rather, from March 16th over the course of a week to March 23rd, there will be 3 waves of mailings to reduce the likelihood of an IT system crash because the Census Bureau is encouraging online response. Next slide, please. Just finishing up with the self-response phase. By mid-April, all homes in the mailing universe that didn't yet self-respond will get a reminder letter, and if they haven't responded yet, they also will get a paper questionnaire in the 4th mailing. So there will be a total of up to 5 mailings, whether it's a postcard or a reminder letter and the like. But in the 4th mailing, if a household hasn't responded yet, they will get a paper questionnaire. I've also noted that there are plans, I know it's of interest to this audience, for questionnaires and instructional guides in multiple languages. And finally, it's really important for people to know that they can respond online without that unique code. For example, if they misplaced the letter they got, or they never got anything in the mail, or they don't think they did, as long as they can submit a valid address that the Census Bureau can check. And the same goes for telephone response. All right, next slide, please. Now, while self-response is going on, you might recall that I talked about the mailing universe, all right? Most homes, again, will get something in the mail to start. However, in rural and remote areas and places with high seasonal turnover and most American Indian reservations, census workers will deliver a packet of materials with both an online invitation and that unique code and a paper questionnaire to about 12 million addresses in what's called the update leave operation. And they will also verify and update the address list as they go. So they update the list and leave the packet of materials. Okay, on to the next slide. And then, by the way, everybody in update leave then again can go online or mail back a paper questionnaire like all the other addresses in the self-response universe. Now, other operations. I want to go through these somewhat quickly, but happy to take questions later. So this slide summarizes the other major counting operations, and I'm sure it's, of interest to many of you who work in vulnerable communities. Let me just highlight a couple of things. The service-based enumeration is a 3-day or 3-night count, March 30th through April 1st, of people experiencing homelessness. This will cover shelters for adults and youth, and for families, mobile food vans, soup kitchens, and then targeted outdoor locations such as under bridges or encampments where homeless people may live. By the way, the outdoor count, which will take place at night, only happens on April 1st. Now, the important thing to know is the Census Bureau is not going to be walking around to soup kitchens and mobile food vans and outdoor locations and looking under bridges willy-nilly. They will be identifying those places using Google searches, but equally important, through outreach to local governments and through nonprofit service providers and the like in the year leading up to the census, starting very soon. So partnerships with the Census Bureau are really important here. The Census Bureau staff out of the local census offices will then make advance contact with all, except for the outdoor locations, with all the areas or facilities, I should say, they intend to visit starting in February of 2020. And again, this operation takes place March 30th through April 1st. Second bullet, they enumerate transitory locations through a separate operation. Again, these are people who aren't experiencing homelessness, but their home is mobile, right? So they're in hotels or motels, marinas, campgrounds, and the like. And again, those locations are identified well in advance as part of the Census Bureau's address canvassing operation that's going on now and also in the field next year. And then finally, the group quarters enumeration. And by the way, the service-based enumeration is technically part of the group quarters enumeration, but that's how the Census Bureau counts group facilities, prisons, college dorms, skilled nursing homes, military installations, and the like. Again, they do the advance contact starting in February of 2020, and the enumeration itself either through individual paper forms that are dropped off at these facilities, through the facility providing a roster, or through electronic data transfer. The Census Bureau will work with the facility to make that determination about the easiest way to conduct the count during this advanced contact period, and that operation goes on through April of 2020. So next slide, please. So now on to the final large but very important large census operation, non-response follow-up, and when you become a census geek, you're going to call it NRFU. So this is what happened. This is the operation that happens when the self-response period ends, and there still is potentially up to 25 to 30 or more % of occupied homes that still haven't responded. So starting in May 13th in most places and running through the end of July 2020, census workers will visit occupied households that didn't self-respond, and they will do that at least once. And if no one answers on the first try, the census taker, called an enumerator, will leave a notice of visit with a code to respond online. We've talked about that before. And the Bureau will send another postcard in a week. And for the first time, the census takers hope not to go out to homes that turn out to be vacant. They are going to use administrative data to try and weed out addresses that are vacant, and they will primarily be relying on Postal Service lists to make that determination. Next slide, please. This is the last slide about the operations. So after one visit to each unresponsive home and sending out that follow-up postcard a week later, the Census Bureau will then make a determination, and they have not yet finalized this process yet, so we're not sure it's going to happen or to what extent, but they will try to determine, can some of those unresponsive households be counted, and I'm doing air quotes around counted, using data from administrative records from federal agencies. That is, data collected for other purposes, such as from the IRS, the Social Security Administration, through Medicare, Indian Health Service, and the like. Now, if not, census takers will continue to visit up to 6 times, so 5 more visits, with homes becoming what's called proxy eligible after 3 unsuccessful attempts to find someone at home to answer the questionnaire. And a proxy count means that enumerators can ask a neighbor, a landlord, a non-resident caregiver, a letter carrier for information about the household. And then again, after 6 unsuccessful visits, the Census Bureau turns to statistical methods and additional administrative records and imputation techniques to fill in the blanks for households that it believes are occupied, but for which it can't collect any data. So we are at the end. If Rima, can we do the last slide? So this is a takeaway slide, everyone. This is just to let you know how you will know as the census is in progress how well it's going. So you can shift and adjust the work that you are doing. You can monitor progress in your communities and then determine how to shift your activities as warranted in real time. The only thing I want to make sure you understand, the Census Bureau will measure progress in terms of the % of addresses all right, that have responded, not in terms of the percent of people, because if they know how many people there are and where they lived, they probably wouldn't need to take a census. So just keep that in mind when you're starting to hear that 20%, of households in Detroit have been counted as of April 1st or whatever the reporting date is. So last slide, please. Thank you again for the opportunity to be with you and for listening to all of this stuff. It's really exciting once it's happening. I am not on Twitter, but yes, we can. Hashtag yes, we can. And I hope everybody will start thinking about ways to promote participation in the communities they serve. So thanks, Terri. Back to you or on to Bill.
It looks like I'm up. You want me to just take off? This is Bill OHare, and first of all, I echo Terri Ann's thank you to everyone for joining this and helping on mobilize, I guess, and promote the 2020 census and to make sure we get as accurate a count as we can. This first slide just tells you what I'm going to try and cover very quickly in about 15 minutes. Talk about some of the key data on the undercount of young children, which is the issue that I have been focused on for the last several years. Talk a little bit about some of the ideas about why young children are missed so often in the census. Underscore a little bit about why the net undercount of young children is so important. And finally, end with a few thoughts about what we can do to reduce the undercount of young children in the 2020 census. So next slide. This is a chart that shows the net undercount for 5-year age groups in the 2010 census. And it goes from the youngest group on the far left with that blue circled bar to the oldest group on the far right. It says minus 0.5. And you can see the undercount bars go down, the overcount bars go up, and you can see on the far left-hand side, the undercount bar for young children is 4.6%. It's by far the highest net undercount of any age group, and it certainly draws our attention to the fact that this is a very difficult population to enumerate accurately, and have much higher net undercounts than any other age group. And that's a surprise to a lot of people. So let me talk a little bit more about that. Let's go to the next slide. So the 4.6% that's repeated here on the far left-hand side, you might want to know how that compares to some of the other major demographic groups in the census. All of these are net undercounts, and you can see to the right of the net undercount for children are data for race groups and Hispanics, and none of those approach the net undercount for young children, although I should be clear that some of the subgroups in them, for example, black men, do have very high net undercounts, Hispanic men as well. So if there are subgroups within those race populations that are as difficult to enumerate as young children, but groups overall, young children are still far and away the most, have the highest net undercount. You can see two more bars for males and females, and finally for owners and renters. And the point here is that for all those major demographic groups, young children have by far the highest net undercount. Let's go to the next slide. This slide looks at the net undercount for total, for Black alone in combination, for Hispanic, and then on the far right-hand side is a proxy estimate for the non-Hispanic white. The Census Bureau doesn't produce a net undercount from DA, which is the source of this for that group, but I put together what I think is a proxy reasonable one. And you can see, and probably not surprised, that for Black alone in combination, the net undercount is 6.3%. For Hispanics, 7.5%. For the proxy non-white, it's a little under 3%. This is not probably surprising to most folks. I do want to parenthetically say that the Census Bureau has updated, particularly the Hispanic undercount estimates in a couple of recent papers, which show it's not quite as high as this, but those are not official numbers, and there are some caveats that go along with them. So I just want to warn people that you may see some other estimates, particularly for Hispanics, they're not quite this high. But even the new revised estimates show that Black and Hispanic children have very high net undercounts in the census. Next slide. Now, the story I've been telling so far is not a very pretty one for young children, but the bottom line is it's actually worse than the data I've been talking about. And I want to make a distinction between two terms that are often used and sound very similar or the same, but are not. One term is net undercounts, and the other term is omissions. And the data I've been showing up till now are for net undercounts. And to to say this a little overly simplified, net undercounts are a balance between people who are missed and people who are counted twice. And so for groups where more people are counted twice than are missed, it's a net overcount. And for groups where more people are missed than are counted twice, it's a net undercount. So net undercounts and omissions are not the same thing. Omissions are only one side of that equation. And this set of this slide that we're looking at now kind of tells you how net undercount compares to omissions. The net on the far, they're looking at the left-hand set of bars. The net undercount shows a net undercount of about almost 1,970,000. But omissions is 2.2 million. 2.2 million young children not included in the 2010 census. And for a lot of purposes, I think omissions is a more relevant measure than net undercounts. If you go to the second set of bars on the right-hand side, it takes those numbers and puts them into percent. And as we've already talked about, the net undercount of 4.6%, but omissions were 10%, 10.3% to be exact. So 1 out of every 10 young children in the 2010 census was missed. And you saw the data for Black and Hispanic kids, and a little bit you're going to look at the data for large counties. And so I think it's very reasonable to assume that minority kids in large urban areas probably have a much higher omission rate than this 10.3%. And to me, that's a stunning figure that in our society, in our census, we miss 10 to 20% of young children. So I guess that's the focus the point I want to make is net undercount only tells you part of the story. Omissions is a bigger part of the story. One of the dilemmas is omissions are only available in a couple different measurements. Net undercount is more widely available, and that's why people tend to use the net undercount figure. Next slide. This looks at the net undercount by single year of age for children. And a couple things I want to point out. First, the age 0, which is those age less 1, is the official number, but it's wrong. A couple of Census Bureau demographers have determined that a number of children who are born after April 1st actually got included in the census, and so the census counts were artificially high, which means the net undercount was artificially low. So I think you can dismiss that number. The main point I want to show here is that young children, 0 to 4, basically have very high net undercounts, but teenagers, 14 to 17, actually have net overcounts. So the point is that we shouldn't treat all children the same because they're very different in terms of the likelihood of being missed in the census. And if you're trying to explain why people are counted or miscounted in the census, it makes a lot of sense to separate out young children from older children. Okay, next slide. This is the net undercounts by county size, going from the smallest counties on the left to the largest counties on the right. And you can see a very clear trend there, but particularly looking at the big counties, 500,000 or more, the net undercount for young children was 7.8% in the 2010 census. That number has been a little bit revised with some updated census data, but the point still is that big cities, big counties, urban counties have higher net undercount rates than smaller counties. Okay, next slide. Another way of looking at this, particularly as we move towards the 2020 census, is children living in hard-to-count census tracts. And the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights Education Fund has a website with all this kind of data up there about children. And I just picked out the 10 cities with the largest percent of children who live in hard-to-count census tracts. And you can see they're very high in some of those cities and quite high in all of the cities here. So it's a way of kind of gauging where we should be targeting resources as we move towards the 2020 census. The next slide. So let me say a word or two about how the 2010 census compares to earlier census. I'll go to the next slide. This red line shows the net undercount for adults from 1950 to 2010, and the blue line shows the net undercount for young children. As you can see there, between 1950 and 1980, their net undercounts were pretty similar, and they were both improving over that period. After 1980, it's a very different story. The difference between the undercount experiences of adults and young children is diverging very rapidly since 1980, and you can see the the undercount for adults has actually moved to an overcount in 2000 and 2010. Well, the net undercount for children has gotten worse in 90, 2000, and 2010. And if you follow the trajectory of the last 3 or 4 censuses, I think it's safe to say unless something changes, we're going to have a higher net undercount in 2020 than we do in 2010. So the critical issue there is what's going to change and what can we do to make it change. Next slide. I just want to show this because it shows how children of different ages have really had very different undercount historical experiences over the last 50 years or so. So the line with the red squares is the age 14 to 17. The kind of middle line there with little X's is age 5 to 13. And the bottom line with the black circles is age 0 to 4. And you can see in 1960, they're almost exactly the same net undercounts, but they have have diverged dramatically over the last 50 years. And the older teenagers, more like the adults, and as we already talked about, younger children have seen a big increase in their net undercount since 1980. Next slide. So let me talk a little bit about why young children are missed. Next slide. And I think it's important to think about this in a couple of different ways. One important aspect to say why young children have a much higher net undercount than older children. It's not sufficient just to say why young children are missed. I think we have to explain why they're missed at a much higher rate than older children. For example, I've had people talk to me about the fact that a lot of young kids live in immigrant families. Immigrant families are hard to count. Well, that's true, but the percent of kids in immigrant families is larger for teenagers than it is for young children. So I don't think that's an explanation of why those two age groups differ so much in terms of census counting. Actually, the second part of the question I'm going to say a few words about, or a couple slides about, is the characteristics of young children that are more likely to be missed or undercounted in the census. So let's go to the next slide. This is some data I've taken from a couple Census Bureau reports, but all of the characteristics down the left-hand side are situations or conditions that are widely believed to be linked to undercounts or omissions in the census. And the second column, 0 to 4, age 0 to 10, shows the percentage of that age group that's in that situation. And you can see for all of those characteristics or situations, young children are more highly concentrated than older children in those high-risk situations. So one of the reasons that young children have higher net undercounts and higher omissions than older children is because they live in the kinds of households and living arrangements that are more difficult to enumerate. Next slide. There's some other reasons why young children are missed, and one is the fact that you often think of young children being left off a questionnaire because the common line is because parents forget they have a 3-year-old, and I don't think there's very many parents that forget. But the reality is about 80 to 85% of the young children who are missed in the 2010 census were living in households that received the census questionnaire. They were on what the Census Bureau called the master address file, which determined who gets sent a census questionnaire. So the takeaway from that is an awful lot of children are not missed because their whole household is missed. They're missed because the people in their household left them off a return census questionnaire. The residual of that is the bottom point there, that only 16% of the cases were young children missed when they, not the residual, I mistakenly said that. Only 16% were the young child the only person missed. Quite often it looks like it's a young child and maybe another sibling and a young parent. One situation that I think kind of makes sense here is a young single mother living with her parents or with someone else, and that young subfamily gets left off the census because they're temporarily, or people think they don't live there, or you can imagine a lot of situations of why they might be missed in the census. Next slide. A couple other reasons that children are missed a lot in the census. One is that, sorry here, I just lost the internet connection. Let me go to my slides. I think I can keep going here. I'm back. Hold on. Okay, sorry. We know that children who are not biological or adopted children are more likely to be missed in the census. That includes grandchildren, niece, nephew, unrelated child, and foster children. So the other flip side of that, I guess, is that biological and adopted children, if they're a biological or adopted child of the householder, who is often the person filling out the form, they're much more likely to be included in the census. If there's something other than that, they're much more likely to be missed. There's also the reality that some respondents may not want to report their child to the government. For example, if they don't trust the government, that's one thing. There's about 1.8 million children living with at least one undocumented parent, and given the addition of the citizenship question on the census on top of everything else going on in terms of policies and rhetoric in the nation's capital, it's not hard to imagine that a lot of those children are in jeopardy of being missed because their parents or the person figuring out the household doesn't want to include them. Another situation that I've heard anecdotally is that if for example, a grandparent is taking care of a young grandchild, but they're living in a housing situation where it's not supposed to have young children, they just will not report that young child because they're afraid that information will get back to the housing authority and they'll lose their rental unit. I just want to mention some reports from an NALEO survey that were reported a week or so ago that about 15% of respondents who have a 0 to 4-year-old in the household either wouldn't report their child or don't think they report their child in the census. So there's a large group of people, certainly in the Latino community, I'm pretty sure it's broader than that, who don't think the Census Bureau wants young children included in the census. I think that's a fruitful avenue for us to pursue in terms of understanding that better and figure out how to message to make sure those young children are included. Next slide. One more part about the citizenship question. Interesting to me that young children, or children, I guess 0 to 17, have a higher non-response to the citizenship question in the American Community Survey than older folks. And if the citizenship question has some ramifications for responding to the census, it seems like it's going to affect children more than some of the older groups. So I just thought this was an interesting slide, and I thought I'd pass this information along. Next slide. So why is it important that we count all young children? I guess the visuals there kind of show it: money and political power. Next slide. Another point that, particularly for young children, or I guess in children in general, just as a kind of a editorial, I guess, unlike any adult group, children can't vote. They don't have the kind of political power that most other adult focus groups have. So using data and research is an important part of the advocacy available to child advocates groups. And the census data provide a lot of the kind of material that we can use in that advocacy. One example here is the Kids Count report, which many of you may know about. 10 of the 16 indicators they use to measure the well-being of children come from census or census-derived data. So data is very important for advocating for children. Another obviously point of the census is political representation, not only apportionment of Congress, but in the redistricting that goes on in states and counties after the census. The fourth thing that may be actually the most important or the easiest to get people to understand is the distribution of federal and state funding and making it equitable by getting a complete and accurate count of children. Next slide. This is a little few factoids, I guess, about that last point of how the census data drives federal funding. A guy named Andy Reamer, who some of you may know, has been working on this Counting for Dollars website for a while. And his most recent estimate said that census-derived data is used to distribute more than $800 billion in federal programs in FY 2016, $850 billion. The 6 largest programs distribute about $589 billion in FY 16. And those 16 large programs are important because 8 of those 16 are focused on children, not always young children, but children. And 2 others, Medicaid and SNAP, have very large child constituencies. So for the biggest programs that use census data for distributing dollars, children are a very important target. And missed children means less money, and it means less money for a decade because of the undercount of children. There's no definitive number about how much it costs if a person is missed, but with some caveats, there was a figure of about $1,200, I think, is a reasonable national average that one could put out. This is from Andrew Reamer's work as well. The next slide. So what can be done to make sure we get an accurate 2020 census? This slide could go on, but let me just mention a few things that I think are key. One is advocating with Congress and the administration of the Census Bureau to make sure they understand how important the census is, the census gets funded adequately, and to make sure that that funding and that attention recognizes the very high net undercount of young children, and that the children get their fair share of attention in the Census Bureau planning. I think Terri Ann mentioned there are census complete count committees that are mostly formed at the state level, more will be formed at local levels. Get involved in those and be a voice for children's interest as they think about how to promote the 2020 census in the state or the community. One can also sign up as a census partner on their website and get a flow of information from the Census Bureau that may be helpful. And I would also urge you to monitor the Census Project, which is a foundation-funded work that keeps up-to-date information on the 2020 census from a Washington perspective, I guess, what the Congress is doing, what the White House is doing, and what the Census Bureau is doing, and what advocacy groups are doing. Next slide. Here's some websites, URLs that I think you might find useful for generally, but also for young children. I won't go over those. I think they're pretty obvious. Next slide. There are two mapping resources I want to draw your attention to, and they're very similar in their aims. It's slightly different in the way they go about it. The Census Bureau has a mapping application they call ROAM, Response Outreach Area Mapper. And the City University of New York has developed a 2020 hard-to-count mapping application. Both URLs are there. As I say, these have pretty similar aims. I think the biggest difference is probably usability, and I've heard people talk about both of them as being good mapping systems. So I will let you choose one from there, I guess. Next slide. I just want to mention that I have been working with some child advocates who you may know, Deb Stein from Partnership for America's Children and Randy Smith for the Children's Leadership Council. We are in the process and pretty close to getting to developing a complete count committee for young children, which we're dubbing Count All Kids. And we're going to have a website up by the middle of October, I believe, that will have some of the things listed there, data, substantive reports, and try and be a hub for information about young children and the census, and also try and be a conduit so we can communicate the interest of child advocates to the Census Bureau and vice versa. So I just want to alert you to that. And the Census Bureau, in an email, told me they're developing a web page to focus on the undercount of young children, focus their material on the undercount of children in one place. Right now there is some material, but it's pretty widely scattered and hard to find. Next slide. So to summarize what I thought I said, what I hope you heard, young children had a higher net undercount than any age group in 2010. Probably not too surprising. Black and Hispanic kids have higher net undercounts than others. The net undercount of young children has been increasing rapidly since 1980, and I think that's incumbent on us to do something different in 2020, or else we'll just see a continued increase. There are many reasons why young children are missed in the census. There are many uses of census data, but young children probably depend as much as any group on getting an accurate census count in terms of the distribution of dollars in the next, in the 2020s, I'm sorry. And there's a growing set of resources for advocates. I touched on some of those, but there's others out there. So I just want to summarize with those things, I guess. And let me see if I have one more slide. Yeah, this is my contact information. I'm happy to talk about this. You got my email there. So again, thanks for listening to this. Thanks for being interested in the census. And let me know if you have any questions.
This is Terri Ann. Bill, are you still on the line?
I am.
Okay. We're waiting to turn it back over to Terri, I think.
That was my understanding, too.
Hi, thank you, Terri Ann and Bill, for that presentation. So for everyone, we will be sending out the PowerPoint as well as the recording of this webinar after today. There are a few different ways that you can ask questions. You can either type in your question to the chat box or type it into the questions box, or if you raise your hand and go to webinar, we can unmute your line. So again, you can type your question into the chat box or the question box, or you can raise your hand to get the line unmuted.
And while we're waiting for people to queue up questions, maybe one question I can ask Bill, but also Terri Ann, would love your thoughts on this. So what should people be thinking about as they're, I guess, thinking about how they can make sure to reach those that are hardest to count in our communities, such as younger children? How do we make sure that we are, in fact, getting the information out there to make sure people understand how to be counted and how to be counted properly?
That's a good question, and there are probably several answers. One, as I already said, is to join a local complete count committee who will be working in your community to make sure there's a complete census count and make sure the interests of young children are represented. One other thing I'll just add, I guess, is in my mind, there's two kinds of institutions, actually three kinds of institutions that regularly connect with young children: pediatricians, childcare, and government services. So to the extent that you can mobilize those providers to talk to their patients and their parents and their people they're involved, meet every day to make sure the census is important and make sure they understand the census and why it's important to make sure young children are counted would probably the most important thing people can do.
Great.
Well, it looks like we don't have any questions from, we have one question from Victor Rubin. Is there any evidence about undercount rates for disaggregated subgroups within the Asian American population?
So I guess I can start with that one. We are getting a bit of an echo, by the way, on our end. I don't know if it's affecting the audience. But Victor, how are you? Good. Thanks for listening into this. And that's a very good question, and one that we've struggled with for quite some time. So the direct answer is there are no official measures of accuracy of what Bill correctly described as net undercounts or net overcounts, or quantifying omissions, that is people missed, or duplications, that is people counted twice, for racial and even ethnic, which currently is just Hispanic origin, for those larger groups. So the Census Bureau has produced net undercount rates, as well as information on omissions and duplications, for example, for the Asian American population in the 2010 census, as well as for the Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander population, which is small enough that I think some of those measurements, since they come from a sample, are a little suspect scientifically. But at any rate, there are no official measurements of accuracy for, let's say, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Vietnamese Americans, and the like. Now, I think there's probably been some ethnographic research, some qualitative research that's been done, and there needs to, in some parts of academia, but there definitely needs to be a lot more. And I'm afraid that the Census Bureau itself is not going to be going in that direction, at least for the 2020 census, because they are under very tight fiscal constraints. And I think that would require, getting that information would require more money to expand their accuracy and coverage evaluation activities, and they just don't have that sort of money right now. Bill, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, let me add 3 points here, I guess, that this triggers. One is that, as I talked about, net undercounts and omissions are different things. In 2020, 2010, I'm sorry, there was a zero net undercount for Asian Americans, but there was a 5.3% omissions rate, higher than the non-Hispanic white omission rate. So don't be fooled. Don't let people be fooled by the fact that there is zero net undercount, because there were significant omissions as measured by the Census Bureau. The second point is that I think there is data that could be marshaled to look at the point you're talking about. One is the kind of undercount characteristics, like how poverty and unemployment and rental. There's a number of indicators that the Bureau actually used to use to produce a hard to count score. One could look at the extent to which the Asian American subgroups have those characteristics, and it would reflect, I think, the difficulty of being enumerated accurately. And a related one, which is my third point, is that you could look at who lives in hard to count neighborhoods or census tracts and look at the distribution of Hispanic subgroups in those hard to count census tracts. So there is no undercount or omission rate for those subgroups, but there is some other data that I think could be used to shed some light on that issue.
And Terri and Bill, if I could just add one closing thought here, because the question Victor raises obviously is very important, because we all know that the diversity of a community like Asian Americans is really far more meaningful than looking at opportunity and access and outcomes in the whole range of societal sectors, such as healthcare, the labor force, and access to housing, to education, and the like, by subgroup. We know that different Asian subgroups do not have equality of opportunity or access in many of these areas by different subgroups. But so it's really important to try to delve into this more. But I want to just make one other point, and Bill, please correct me, but I'm going to speculate, based on what I know, that for immigrant populations, so Asian American immigrants, especially potentially first generation, but even second generation, I suspect that there may be a harder time getting an accurate count of older people, or a more difficult time than the older population as a whole, as Bill was describing, which is overall overcounted, because of language barriers. And I think it would be, in many cases, it's older immigrants, especially in the Asian American community, that may have higher language barriers than younger ones. So I think it's really important to look at those possible challenges when thinking about ways to reach people and convince them to participate in the census and help them participate.
Let me just add one other point. That was a good point, Terri Ann. But also, I think, remember that people bring the census in other countries aren't always viewed as positively as we view ours, and immigrants often bring those negative views about a census with them to this country, and so they may view our census through the lens of what a census is like in some home country.
And then one other thing, this is Terri, that I just wanted to add is that we have, of course, heard about anecdotal stories that indicate that there are undercounts in specific, subgroups or detailed groups. So, for example, in the 2000 census, the numbers that came back for the Cambodian population in Long Beach, California, didn't seem to match what local advocates were seeing from the data collected from Long Beach itself. So the total number of Cambodians, from what I understood, did not match with the number of Cambodian children that existed in their school systems, right? So that is, the number of children that were indicated to be in the school district meant that the total number of Cambodians collected for the Census Bureau would have meant, a certain number of, each family would have had to have a certain number of kids to actually make that work. And so we know through stories like that, and certainly would appreciate, if other people have stories like that, sharing them, so that we can help make the case for why it's so important to try to collect this information and report out on undercount for subgroups.
And Terri and everyone, that's an important point. That's actually not anecdotal evidence. That's sort of research or analysis, a comparison, for example, of children of a certain subgroup. in school records, that would, fall under scientific research. So that's exactly the sort of analysis or that would be helpful going forward.
Great. We have another question from Lynn Crowley. I heard citizenship will be asked during the 2020 census. What is the current status on that?
Oh, can you say it again? I couldn't hear.
Terri.
So this is Terri. Just to quickly go over this, because the conversation can easily be quickly subsumed by the citizenship issue. Back in late March of this year, it was announced by the Secretary of Commerce that they will be adding a citizenship question to the 2020 form that goes to every household. Currently, there are 6 lawsuits that have been brought to challenge this inclusion of the citizenship question, and those are working its way through the courts. For folks who are interested in following more how these cases are going, I invite you to follow Hansi, Hansi Lo Wang, with NPR. He's been doing a fantastic job of following what's been going on and reporting out on it. If you are on Twitter, I would greatly encourage you to follow what he's been doing on Twitter. And if not, he has also been pushing out great content with respect to either podcasts or articles through the NPR website.
All right, thank you. Next question is from Aso Washings, and this is regarding a graph that was shown earlier. After the 1980s, why did the undercount of children increase while the count of adults became more accurate?
It's a great question. I don't think we have any good answer for it, including me or the Census Bureau. We could speculate a little bit about, for example, there are more Hispanic kids, but that doesn't really address the question. I think I don't have a good answer to that. It's a great question.
Thank you. It looks like we don't have any additional questions. So Terri Ann and Bill, thank you for joining us today, and thanks to everyone who joined the webinar. We'll be sending out a copy of the presentation and recording, and we'll be in touch again shortly.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.